It all started on a Friday night when my wife of 8 years, Stephanie, and I received an invitation to her best friend Alice's birthday party. Alice and Stephanie had been close since college, and over the years we had been to dozens of Alice's house parties, and this one felt no different. Stephanie looked gorgeous in her blue dress as we set up. Her hair was immaculately styled and it fit her figure perfectly. She asked how I looked, as lovely as ever. I grinned. Alice laughed. I think you could take the limelight away from her. It's about her tonight, so don't be silly. It was about 8 o'clock when we got to Alice's house. There were a lot of people there, both familiar and unfamiliar. Alice was holding a drink. When she greeted us at the door, she gave Stephanie a big hug and said, "Ben, Stephanie, I'm so glad you made it," with music blaring and laughter echoing through the rooms. The party was lively for a while. Stephanie and I stayed together while hanging out with some friends to relax. We even had a few drinks. It was then I saw him. He was tall. He was standing across the room with a whiskey glass in his hand. I'm not sure if it was the alcohol or my intuition, but there was something unsettling about the way he was looking at her. I nudged Stephanie and asked, "Who is this guy?" "Oh, that's just Alice's boyfriend, Ryan HK," she said nonchalantly. "I think I met him last year at her housewarming." Ryan lifted his glass a little towards us. Then Stephanie gave a polite smile. She looked at me to avoid being weird. She laughed and said, "Ben Hune wasn't dangerous, no harm done." I muttered to myself, "Yes, of course." I tried to ignore the sensation, telling myself I was just being overly suspicious. I let him go because Stephanie didn't pay much attention to him. She laughed and chatted with some of her friends. After a while, I lost sight of her in the crowd, but I stayed close. I quickly looked around the room, not wanting to overthink it, but I couldn't find her. Alice was busy talking to a group of guests near the dining area. When I made my way over to the dining area, I looked around quickly, not wanting to overthink it, but I couldn't find her. Alice paused to think. She was on her way to the kitchen. "The last time I saw her, she should be there." "Thank you," I said. I was walking towards the kitchen when I rounded the corner and came to a stop. Stephanie was standing next to Ryan at the counter. Ryan was leaning in a little too much as they talked. Their heads were pressed together with her drink in one hand and her necklace tucked in lightly. The other Stephanie was laughing at something he said. I walked straight up to them, my fists clenched. "Stephanie," I said, sounding sharper than I meant to. They both turned to face me. Stephanie said, her smile faltered a little, "Hey Ben, what's going on?" I glared at Ryan and said, "Mind if I interrupt?" Ryan put his hands up in a protective manner. "No problem, dude, we were just talking." I turned my attention to Stephanie and ignored him. "Can we talk?" After hesitating, she nodded. "Sure." We walked back to the living room. After she put down her drink, I asked in a low voice. She frowned and said, "We were just talking. What's the big deal?" I said, trying to keep my composure. The way he leaned in, he was all over you, Stephanie. It didn't seem like a simple conversation. She crossed her arms. "You're going overboard. I told you Ben is Alice's boyfriend. All we were doing was talking." I gave a frustrated shake of my head. "The way he looks at you bothers me. It's disrespectful to our marriage and to me." Stephanie's face softened as she sighed. "If it bothers you, I'm sorry, but I assure you nothing is going to happen. Could we just relax and enjoy the party?" The look in her eyes made me back down temporarily, though I wanted to push harder. "All right," I said, "but don't bother him." She nodded. "All right." The discomfort in my chest persisted even after we resumed our socializing. I made an effort to concentrate on our conversation. I focused on other conversations and even managed to laugh at a few jokes. And for a while things seemed to be back to normal. After an hour or so, I was engaged in a lengthy discussion with a coworker who was also at the party, and we went out for another drink. As time went on, Stephanie excused herself, and I realized she hadn't returned. A strange uneasiness came over me as I moved away from the crowd. The sound of laughter and muffled voices faded as I began to make my way down the hallway towards the bedrooms. The hallway was eerily quiet, and all the doors were closed. I stopped at the first door and pressed my ear to it, but there was no movement or sound. Every time I strained to hear something, anything, the rooms were silent. So I went to the next door. I walked past the toilet. On my way to the last door, I stopped at the heavy wooden door. I could hear faint voices. I pressed closer, trying to make out the words, and my heartbeat quickened. After a few seconds, I recognized the voice as that of a woman laughing and talking, but it wasn't Stephanie. I walked to the last door, relieved but still uneasy. I stood there with my heart pounding in my chest. At first there was nothing but silence, and then I heard Stephanie laughing, clearly and softly. And softly my stomach churned and the laughter stopped, replaced by another sound, faint whispers followed by the distinct sound of moaning. My hand hovered over the door. I felt as if the ground beneath me was collapsing. The knob trembled as a storm of anger and heartbreak swept through me. I inhaled deeply before opening the door, and everything fell apart. My wife was lying on the bed with Ryan tangled in the sheets, his shirt unbuttoned and her dress off. At first, they didn't even notice me, unable to comprehend what I was witnessing. Unable to comprehend what I was witnessing, I stood motionless. Stephanie, her head jerked towards me, and her eyes widened in surprise as I spoke, barely raising my voice above a whisper. God forbid, Ben, this is not safe. My voice shook with rage as I spoke. I saw enough. Ryan leaned back against the headboard, looking totally unconcerned. It's not what it looks like, man, calm down. I gave a sour laugh. Not what it looks like really is your best option. With tears running down her cheeks, Stephanie hurried to cover herself with the sheet. Then allow me to clear my chest. I shook my head and hurried out of the room. How could she hurt me and us like this? She followed me down the hall. Ben, please stop being so barefoot and unkempt. I made a mistake. I wasn't thinking. So I said, oh, so now it's the alcohol's fault. As I turned to face her, when you smiled at him across the room, you were thinking perfectly. Don't act like this just happened. She flinched. I didn't mean for this to happen. I love you, Ben. For this I yelled, love me for this. I didn't mean for this to happen. I yelled, love me, Stephanie. You don't degrade someone you love like this. You don't betray them. The disturbance was beginning to be noticed by the partygoers. Alice came over to us with a worried look on her face. I said icily, what's going on to your friend? She has a lot to explain. Sobbing, Stephanie buried her face in her hands. Alice glanced at Stephanie and then back at me, trying to defuse the situation. She said, Ben, allow them to talk privately. I grabbed my coat and said, I'm done talking, have fun. Hours passed as I drove incoherently, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I kept seeing images of Stephanie and Ryan, each one more vivid than the last. I experienced an uncontrollable storm of emotions that included anger, guilt, and pain. I drove for what seemed like an eternity, trying to get away from her because I couldn't face her yet. The thought ran through my mind and I looked at the screen as my phone buzzed. Stephanie was the one I chose to ignore. I wasn't prepared for her calling over and over again. My stomach twisted even more when I saw her name on the screen. I couldn't talk to her like that. I finally made it to Damon's house when everything fell apart. He was one of the few people I knew I could rely on at almost 2 a.m. I knocked on his door. What the hell, Ben, it's late. When he opened the door, Damon said in a groggy voice, I apologize for being here so late, man, but there is an emergency. I told him in a shaky voice that I knew I needed to talk to someone but didn't know how to explain it. Damon moved to make room for me. He moved to make room for me, and with shaking hands I took a seat on the couch as we entered the living room. Damon sat across from me and gave me a worried look, trying to regain my composure before I spoke. Barely more than a whisper. Ryan in a bedroom. I saw them together. Yes, they were. I kept thinking about how close they were and I couldn't finish the sentence. Damon remained silent for a while, shock and disbelief visible on his face. I can't believe it, man, I said. A nod. They were visible to me. I don't know what to do. I can go home right now. I can't even look at them. I'll just go to a hotel. I've stopped feeling like I'm being crushed by everything. I've lost all sense of reality. After allowing myself to calm down for a while, Damon finally spoke. At a hotel. Have you gone crazy? You don't have to be alone right now. You can stay here tonight. Are you sure? I was still trying to make sense of it all. I asked. Yes, he said firmly. You won't be leaving? Thank you. I nodded. Thank you, man. I tried to gather my thoughts by sitting back and stroking my hair, but my phone kept buzzing. As I tried to relax, when I pulled it out, Stephanie was calling again. I couldn't bring myself to answer, but my fingers lingered over the screen. I saw the call go to voicemail then, right? I didn't answer it. I couldn't as the calls kept coming in. I just watched the screen. They were all like reminders of the betrayal. The silence was broken by Damon's voice. What do you think you're going to do now? I exhaled deeply. My chest heaved. I'm going to get a divorce. Even though I still had doubts about everything, my words felt final. As I finally made up my mind, Damon nodded. I know a good lawyer. If you need his number, I can give it to you. Excellent. Many thanks, dude. Thank you so much. I spoke in a calm but serious tone. I returned to the house the next morning by car. I couldn't stay away forever. When I entered the front door, I knew it would be difficult to get the few things I needed, mostly clothes. Stephanie's eyes were red from crying as she sat on the couch. When she saw me, she stood up. We need to talk, Ben, she said in a shaky voice. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I just brushed her aside and went upstairs to the bedroom. I picked up my jacket, some pants, and a couple of shirts. Her eyes followed me, and I could feel them standing in the doorway. She said, Ben, I didn't mean for this to happen. We can work this out. This, please. You have to realize it was a mistake. My hands still clutching the clothes in my arms, I turned to her. Is that how you see it? A mistake, Stephanie? I asked in a firm but low voice. Unable to answer, she looked away. Even though I could see the guilt in her eyes, nothing changed. My chest tightened as I remembered the moment I saw you with him. I can't stop thinking about that image. I can't stay here, you know. I can't stay here. You know I'm going to file for divorce. Her face turned pale. Please, Ben, I'm so sorry. Give me another chance. I'll do everything in my power to make things right. With a heavy heart, I shook my head. No, it's too late. I gathered my remaining belongings and left without looking back. I knew there was no turning back. Once I got in the car, I knew I couldn't live a lie any longer, but I had no idea what lay ahead. The divorce took months to complete, only a few months to go. Stephanie called me a few more times, but I didn't Answer: I had to get over this. Damon supported me when I needed it and guided me through the process. Eventually everything calmed down. Even though the pain persisted, I learned to deal with it. As I focused on starting over, I didn't feel bad about walking away. Even though it wasn't easy, there was no other option.